Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And I've put it here on the screen for you, and I'll just go ahead and read it. He writes that every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action as well as choice, is held to aim at some good. Hence, people have nobly declared that the good is that at which all things aim. Okay, so let's just pause here and try to break this down, what he's getting at. Really what he's saying is that every choice we make aims at some good. Okay, every choice, every decision, every action that we take ultimately has an end goal in mind. So this is a teleological view of ethics. A teleological view of ethics. Aristotle is concerned with action not as being right or wrong in itself, but with action as conducive to man's good. The actions that lead to the good will be considered right. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, think of it like this. If somebody asked you the question, why are you listening to this lecture? Well, you might respond by saying, I'm listening to the lecture in order that I can better understand the material, the course material. And someone could ask you another question saying, well, why do you want to understand the course material? And you could respond by saying, well, because the better I understand it, the better grade I'm going to get in the class. And if someone asked you, well, why do you want a good grade in the class? You could respond by saying, well, I need grades to earn credits. And if they asked you, why do you want credits? You could say, well, I need credits to graduate. Well, why do you want credits to graduate? Well, I need to get a good job, and I got to graduate and get a degree in order to get a good job. Well, why do you want a good job? Well, I want a good job because I want to make money, right? And a good job possibly could lead to more money. Well, why do you want more money? Well, so I can live a better lifestyle. Well, why do you want a better lifestyle? Ultimately, what Aristotle is getting at here, and I know it's a long chain reasoning there, but ultimately what he's getting at is that happiness is the end goal of our action. So even listening to this lecture here, long term, your goal in doing so is to attain that good, right? That supreme good which he identifies as happiness. All actions and choices, then, he thinks aim at some good, even just the mere action of listening to this lecture. Okay? So the good, he believes, is the end of all action. All action is directed toward the good. So the good for Aristotle is the highest end, right? It's the end that we desire for its own sake, right? We don't desire the good for any other reason. Like, you might desire a good grade in order to get credits. You desire credits in order to graduate. You desire to graduate in order to get a good job. But eventually, Aristotle thinks this type of reasoning has to come to an end. And the end will be something that is superior to all the other steps simply because we desire it for its own sake. Okay, the good is something that all of our actions are directed toward. Okay? And he goes on in Book 1 in the Nicomachean Ethics to tell us that human beings generally agree that the good is happiness. Okay, so that highest goal that we're all striving for, the human good, is equivalent to happiness. So we could appropriately say that happiness is the end which we desire for its own sake. Now, here's the problem that Aristotle correctly addresses in Book 1 of his Nicomachean Ethics. The problem is human beings disagree over what constitutes happiness. Right? So if we say that happiness is the end goal of all action, the natural question would be, okay, well, what is happiness? Is there only one way to become happy? I mean, are there multiple ways that we can become happy? Is there one best life or one good life that we have to live in order to acquire happiness? Is happiness completely relative to the individual? So what makes you happy might not make me happy, and vice versa. Can human beings ever be confused about what constitutes happiness, and so on? So obviously, I mean, there's a lot of questions regarding happiness, and there's a lot of controversy surrounding the nature of happiness. So Aristotle, being a good philosopher, decides to take up this question of what is happiness. And he does so in a very methodical, very rational way. I mean, obviously, if happiness is the end goal that we're all striving for, we really need to take some time to better understand what happiness is all about. And in Book 1, he talks about 3 different views of happiness. The first view is that happiness is equivalent to pleasure. And we're all familiar with people like this. People who think that the highest human good is nothing but pure pleasure. So whether it's food, drink, sex, physical pleasure, there are people, many people, who think that happiness is just pleasure itself, pure and simple. Well, Aristotle is very dismissive of this view. Okay, he thinks that obviously to associate happiness with nothing but pleasure would put human beings on the level of animals. Okay, it would put human beings on the level of cattle or pigs who do nothing but desire their own bodily fulfillment, whether it's food, drink, reproduction, or whatever. Aristotle is real harsh on the view that happiness is associated with pleasure. Ultimately, because he thinks it will conflict and contradict what is most noble and good about the human being itself. And we'll talk more about that here as we go. The other view that Aristotle discusses is that happiness has to do with wealth. Okay, so to achieve happiness, you have to be wealthy, right? You have to have money to spend, to buy things with. Well, there may be some truth to that, and Aristotle does agree that you do have to have a certain amount of wealth to be happy. I mean, obviously, someone living in abject poverty whose every thought was thinking about their physical survival, that person wouldn't have the leisure necessary to pursue happiness. So, I mean, some wealth is required, Aristotle thinks, in order to be happy. But wealth is not equivalent to happiness. Okay, so just because you have wealth, that doesn't mean that you're going to be happy. And if we think about it, he makes a pretty good point here, because wealth and money are normally pursued as a means to a greater end, right? People pursue money because it can buy them stuff, right? They can buy things with money. So even money itself always points beyond itself to something else, something you can buy, or is something you can possess, whether it's security or maybe that new car, that new house, whatever. But money is really a means to a greater end than itself. So that doesn't quite meet the criteria that Aristotle has set out here. But what about honor? Honor is the third one. So we've had pleasure, wealth, and now honor. And these Aristotle things tend to be the most common views of how people view happiness. So what about honor? Well,